If you've ever been on a plane during turbulence, you probably had that thought. Just for a second, what if this goes wrong? What if we don't make it? On October 13th, 1972, for a group of young men, their friends, and their families, that fear became real. A Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying members of an amateur rugby team, along with relatives and friends, was flying through the Andes Mountains toward Chile. It was supposed to be a routine trip, a short journey, a game, a weekend. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing and unbelievable survival stories ever recorded. Because when the plane crashed deep in the snow-covered Andes, the people who survived were left trapped in a white world of silence, with freezing temperatures, no rescue, and almost no food. And what they were forced to do in order to stay alive is the part of the story most people never forget. The plane was a Fairchild FH-227D, military transport, not designed for comfort. It carried 45 people in total, players from the Old Christians Club rugby team, their friends, family members, and crew. The Andes were dangerous to cross even in good conditions. Cloud cover, ice, sudden shifts in visibility, and mountains high enough to leave almost no room for error. Because of bad weather, the flight was delayed and had to stop in Mendoza, Argentina. The passengers stayed overnight. The next day, they took off again, trying to complete the journey. At first, it felt normal. Conversation, jokes, young athletes on a trip. Some were relaxed, some were nervous. Then the aircraft entered cloud cover. Visibility dropped, and somewhere in those mountains, a fatal navigation error was made. The crew believed they had cleared the highest peaks. They began descending, but they were still deep in the Andes. And then, without warning, the plane struck the mountain. One wing clipped a ridge, then the other. The tail section tore away. The fuselage was ripped open. Passengers were thrown out into the freezing air. The remaining body of the aircraft, now just a broken shell, slid down the snow like a sled. Metal screaming, bodies colliding, luggage tearing loose. And then, silence. When it stopped, some were dead instantly. Others were dying. Many were severely injured. The survivors had no idea where they were, only that they were high in the mountains, surrounded by snow, with no shelter except the shattered fuselage. The cold set in fast. At that altitude, temperatures dropped brutally at night. Many of them were wearing light clothing, travel clothes, not winter gear. Inside the wreckage, they began pulling people closer together, trying to keep warm. They used seat cushions, luggage, and broken pieces of the plane to block open sections. There was pain everywhere. Broken legs, head injuries, internal injuries, shock. Some survivors, barely adults, suddenly had to act like medics. They checked pockets for anything useful. Cigarettes, chocolate, a few bottles, tiny scraps of food. Nothing close to enough. One of the most haunting parts of the story is how quickly they understood the truth. This wasn't a situation where help was coming in an hour or by nightfall. They were isolated, and the mountains around them looked endless. Still, they had hope. The plane had gone missing. Authorities would search. They just had to stay alive long enough to be found. So they organized themselves. Small jobs, small routines. Who would care for the injured? Who would check supplies? Who would look outside when weather allowed? They melted snow in metal scraps for water. They rationed food into tiny portions. A sip, a bite, a crumb. At first, they still believed rescue planes would spot them. So during the day, they listened. And sometimes, They heard engines. Imagine that. Hearing an aircraft somewhere above the clouds. Knowing people were searching. And realizing they still couldn't see you. The fuselage was white. The snow was white. The crash site blended into the mountain. From the air, they were almost invisible. Days passed. The small food supply was gone almost immediately. There were no plants to gather, no animals to hunt, no wood for fire, only snow, ice, wind. As the days dragged on, hunger changed everything. People became weaker, thoughts slowed, conversations became shorter. The injured suffered more. Some prayed constantly. Some tried to stay practical. Some drifted between hope and despair by the hour. And then came one of the moments that broke them. They managed to hear a radio report. The search had been called off. Authorities believed there were no survivors. The mountains were too vast. The weather was too harsh. The chances were too low. For the people inside that wreckage, it was like hearing their own deaths announced. No one was coming. That realization changed the story from survival to something darker. Because now the question wasn't, how long until rescue? It was, how do we stay alive here? At all? The answer was waiting around them in the snow. The bodies of those who had died in the crash. This is the part many people rush through, or reduce to a shocking headline. But for the survivors, it wasn't a headline. It was a slow, horrifying moral collapse caused by starvation. They were deeply religious young men. Many of them struggled with the idea for days. Some refused at first. Some cried. Some argued. They tried to justify it spiritually, as an act of survival, as a final gift from the dead to the living. They told themselves that if the situation were reversed, they would want the same done. Even then, making the choice was excruciating. Starvation is hard to understand unless you've experienced it. Not hunger after skipping lunch. Real starvation, where your body is shutting down and your mind begins narrowing toward one thing: food. Eventually, some of them did what they had to do. Then others followed. That decision kept them alive, and it haunted them for the rest of their lives. Weeks passed in the fuselage. The survivors built routines to stay sane. They cleaned the interior, managed water, cared for the wounded, tried to preserve strength. But the mountain was not done with them. One night, as they slept inside the wreckage, an avalanche struck. Snow slammed into the fuselage with crushing force. It poured through openings and buried people where they lay. In the darkness, half asleep and suffocating, they clawed at packed snow, trying to breathe. Some survivors were trapped for hours. Others died in the avalanche. The wreckage that had barely served as shelter became a frozen tomb. The people who got out had to dig each other free. Imagine surviving a plane crash, surviving starvation, and then being buried alive in the same place you were trying to survive in. After the avalanche, morale collapsed again. They were weaker, fewer in number, and the weather still showed no mercy. By this point, some of them understood a brutal fact. They could not wait any longer. If anyone was going to make it out, someone had to leave the crash site and cross the mountains on foot. That idea sounded almost impossible. They were at high altitude, in freezing conditions, with no proper climbing gear, no map that could save them. But impossible had already become normal. Several attempts were discussed. Explorations near the site, testing routes, trying to understand the terrain. Each trip cost energy they barely had. At one point, survivors managed to reach the tail section of the aircraft, which had torn away during the crash. Inside, they found useful items, including clothing and other supplies. It was a rare moment of hope. They even improvised gear from what they had. sunglasses to reduce snow blindness, layers of fabric for warmth, and eventually, a sleeping bag stitched together from insulation and materials from the plane. That sleeping bag would become critical, because without it, an expedition across the mountains would likely end in freezing death. Finally, 3 survivors set out on the journey that would decide everything. Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin. They climbed away from the wreckage, step by step, through snow and wind, not even fully knowing what was beyond the next ridge. From the crash site, the mountains had always looked like walls. And when they reached the top of one of the ridges, they saw the truth. More mountains, endless peaks, no roads, no towns, no obvious path to civilization. For a moment, it must have felt hopeless. All that effort, all that suffering, just to discover they were even deeper in isolation than they imagined. But they kept going, because turning back with no rescue plan meant death anyway. Eventually, Vizintin returned to the crash site so that the remaining food and supplies could last longer for the 2 continuing the trek. That left Parado and Canessa alone, 2 exhausted survivors, crossing one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges in the world, with almost nothing. They walked for days, over snow, rock, ice, sleeping in brutal cold, waking up to do it again. Their bodies were already damaged by starvation and altitude. Every step must have felt like dragging weight through a nightmare. And yet they kept moving. At times they argued. At times, they doubted they were even going the right direction. But there was no other choice. Keep walking, or disappear into the mountains like everyone assumed they already had. As they descended, conditions slowly changed. Less snow in places, signs of life, waterways, vegetation. After so long in a frozen world, even seeing green again must have felt unreal. Then, after around 10 days of trekking, they saw something that probably looked impossible at first. A human being. A Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan was on the other side of a river. The current was too strong and loud to cross or communicate clearly. So they shouted, waved, tried to explain who they were. Catalan understood enough to realize this was serious. He returned the next day and threw them food tied to a stone, along with paper, so they could write a message. On that note, they explained the unthinkable. They were survivors of the plane crash. Others were still alive in the mountains. After more than 2 months, authorities were alerted. This time, the rescue effort was very real. Helicopters were sent into the Andes. Because of altitude and weather, not everyone could be extracted at once. The first rescue flights took some survivors out, and rescuers returned for the rest the next day. 16 people survived. 16 out of 45. The world reacted with shock. First at the survival itself, then at the details of how they had survived. When the truth about cannibalism emerged, headlines exploded. Some people judged them instantly. Others, after understanding the conditions, saw it differently. The survivors eventually spoke openly about their decision. Not proudly, but honestly. They knew what people would think. They also knew that without that choice, none of them would be alive to explain it. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. It's not just a crash story. It's a story about what happens when civilization disappears overnight. No heat, no food, no rescue, no certainty that anyone even knows where you are. We like to imagine there are lines we would never cross. But in the Andes, those lines were buried under snow. Some of the survivors went on to live long lives. Many carried the memory forever. Not just of the crash, but of the voices, the cold, the dead, and the impossible choices. Over the years, books and films told the story again and again. What would you do? If survival demanded something you never thought you could do, there's another reason this case remains so haunting. It strips away the illusion that survival is always heroic in a clean, cinematic way. Sometimes survival is ugly, messy, morally devastating. Sometimes surviving means living with memories that never leave. And maybe that's the darkest part. Not that they crashed, not that they were stranded, not even what they had to do to stay alive, but that after all of it, after the snow, the hunger, the avalanche, the climb, and the rescue, they still had to come back to the world and explain the mountain. Even now, decades later, the Andes crash is remembered as one of the most extreme survival events in modern history. Not because it was impossible to survive, but because the survivors proved that human beings can endure far more and sacrifice far more than most of us want to imagine. So the next time you hear a story described as unbelievable, remember this one. A plane disappears into the mountains. The search is called off. The dead outnumber the living. The living run out of food. An avalanche buries the survivors. 2 men walk for 10 days through the Andes. And 16 people come home from a place they were never supposed to leave alive is less than #0. 5# is greater than. If this story proves anything, it's that fear can break people. But sometimes, so can hope. Because hope is what kept them waiting. Hope is what kept them rationing. Hope is what pushed them up those mountains. And hope, more than anything, is what made the ending possible. But for 72 days in the Andes, hope came with a cost written in snow, silence, and the memory of everyone who never came back. There are details from the Andes that make this story even harder to process, because they show how survival wasn't one single decision. It was hundreds of decisions. Every day, sometimes every hour. Who gets the warmest spot inside the fuselage? Who spends energy digging? Who risks going outside during a storm? Who eats? And how much? That kind of pressure can destroy a group. But somehow, they managed to create order in chaos. Some survivors became natural organizers. Some became caretakers for the injured. Some kept morale alive with conversation, humor, or prayer. In a place where death felt close every day, those roles mattered. The mountain also changed time. Days blurred together. Sunrise meant another chance to survive. Night meant another fight against the cold. And when weather closed in, the world shrank to the inside of a broken aircraft. Imagine the sounds in there. Wind scraping against metal. People breathing in the dark. Someone in pain trying not to cry out. Someone praying under their breath. No phones. No lights. No way to distract yourself. Just cold and waiting. And then morning comes, and you realize you have to do it all again. Another detail people don't talk about enough is altitude. The crash site was more than 3,500 meters above sea level. At that elevation, your body is already under stress. Breathing is harder. Movement drains you faster. Sleep isn't restful. Healing slows down. Now add injuries, starvation, dehydration, and freezing temperatures. That's the environment these survivors endured for 72 days. And even after all the years since 1972, was it really possible to survive there? The answer is yes, but only barely. Because survival in the Andes wasn't a miracle in the simple sense. It was discipline, luck, improvisation, endurance, and the willingness to do things most people can't even imagine. There were moments when rescue was painfully close in a different way, too. Aircraft searched overhead during the early days. The survivors heard them. They tried to signal. But because of the terrain and the color of the wreckage against the snow, the planes passed by. To be alive hearing the sound of salvation, and still not being seen. That kind of thing can break a person. And for some, it almost did. There were emotional crashes inside the group. Moments of anger, despair, exhaustion, people questioning whether it was worth fighting any longer. But then someone would force movement. A task, a plan, a discussion about the next day. And that momentum mattered. Because in survival situations, stillness can become surrender. The men who eventually walked out of the Andes are often described as heroes. And they were. But what's easy to miss is that the rescue was a group achievement. Those who stayed behind supported the expedition, shared supplies, accepted risk, trusted that someone else might succeed where rescue teams had failed. That trust is extraordinary, especially after so much loss. And there had been so much loss. Not everyone who survived the initial crash survived the days after. Some died from injuries, some from the cold, some in the avalanche. So every day the survivors woke up. The group was smaller than before. That changes a person. It changes how you think about time, how you think about choices, how you think about guilt. Why did one person live and another die? Why did one seat become a death sentence while another became a chance? There's no clean answer, and survivors of disasters often carry that question for life. The Andes case also became a study in psychology, not just because of the survival decisions, but because of how the group preserved meaning. They did not survive by acting like machines. They survived by staying human in impossible conditions. They told stories. They argued. They comforted each other. They planned. They prayed. Even in that environment, they tried to hold on to identity. And maybe that's what separates this from a simple disaster timeline. This isn't just a sequence of events. It's a record of human beings refusing to disappear, even when the mountain was trying to erase them. What happened after rescue? Because surviving the Andes did not mean the ordeal was over. The men who came home had to face doctors, families, reporters, and eventually, the entire world. And the world wanted answers. What happened up there? How did you survive? What did you eat? For people who had just been pulled out of one of the worst environments imaginable, that kind of public attention must have felt unreal. Some details had to be explained quickly because rumors were spreading. And once the truth came out, it became international news. That truth made some people uncomfortable. Maybe because it forced them to ask a question they didn't want to ask themselves. If I were there, would I have done the same? Most people like to answer that from the comfort of a warm room. But warmth changes morality. Food changes morality. Safety changes morality. In the Andes, those things were gone. The survivors eventually framed their choice in terms of survival and sacrifice, not as something monstrous, but as something tragic and necessary. And many families of those who died supported them. That part matters, because it reminds us that the story was never just about shock. It was also about grief, love, and the terrible intimacy of depending on one another to live. Over time, the Andes crash became one of those stories people return to whenever they want to understand the edge of human endurance. Military survival training, disaster psychology, leadership under pressure, group dynamics, faith under extreme conditions. It has all of it. But for all the analysis, for all the books and interviews and films, the core image remains simple. A broken plane, half buried in snow, high in the Andes, with people inside waiting to be seen. That image alone is enough to haunt anyone. And if you think about it long enough, you start to realize how many times this story could have ended differently. If the weather had been worse on the trekking days, the expedition might have failed. If they hadn't improvised a sleeping bag, the cold might have killed them in the mountains. If the muleteer hadn't returned with paper and food, Communication could have failed. If the search had never been reactivated, the remaining survivors might not have lasted much longer. The distance between survival and tragedy was razor thin, for 72 days straight. That's why this story doesn't feel like a normal survival tale. It feels like a chain of near impossible outcomes balanced against constant death. And somehow, just enough things went right. At the last possible moment. There's also something deeply unsettling about the setting itself. Snow usually looks clean, quiet, almost peaceful. But in the Andes, it became a threat. Snow hid wreckage. Snow buried bodies. Snow reflected sunlight hard enough to blind. Snow trapped heat away from them at night. Snow was water, shelter, and enemy, all at once. And mountains have a way of making people feel small, even in safe conditions. In a survival situation, they can make you feel erased. No landmarks you understand. No easy direction. No guarantee that effort leads anywhere. Just ridges, white horizons, and the possibility that the next step is the one that kills you. When people call this one of the darkest survival stories ever, they aren't exaggerating. A catastrophic crash, isolation, starvation, moral collapse, an avalanche, and a final desperate journey through the mountains. And still, what survives in memory isn't only the horror, it's the resilience. 16 people lived. 16 people walked out of a place where the world had already counted them dead. That fact alone sounds fictional, but it happened. And that may be why this story still spreads across generations. Not because it comforts us, but because it forces us to look at what human beings become. When stripped down to survival, some become leaders, some become caregivers, some become explorers, some become the reason others keep going one more day. And all of them, whether they lived or died, became part of a story written in one of the harshest places on Earth. So if you're watching this at night, in a warm room, with food nearby, and the sound of wind outside your window, just imagine hearing that same wind, through torn metal, high in the Andes, with no rescue coming, and no idea whether morning would be your last. That's where this story happened. Not in a movie, not in a myth, on a mountain, in the snow, for 72 days. And when people say the survivors did the unthinkable, they're right. But the truth is, they also did something else. They endured the unimaginable. Long enough to be found.